I'll say a couple things to set some scaffolding here about this topic. And again, invite any questions or comments into the chat box, or please hold them and then we'll open it up. But as a way to begin here, and acknowledging that each of us will be coming to this conversation from many different locations. Some of you might work daily with trauma as a clinician, or you might be experiencing trauma yourself. Wherever you're coming from, it's welcome. I invite you to think of or reflect on two different people and two different paths. These are hypothetical. And both of these people are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And they both lived through an event that left them feeling profoundly unsafe in their bodies and dysregulated. And they came to meditation practice, with some of the promise of maybe some healing of their pain and suffering. And the first person experiences tremendous benefit from meditation practice. They feel empowered to be turning their attention towards their body. They end up feeling more able to regulate their emotions more skillfully. The traumatic reminders that were in both the sensations and also intrusive thoughts have subsided somewhat, and practice for them becomes a place of refuge. It supports them in their process of trauma recovery over time. And imagine this other person who's coming to practice and has really quite the opposite experience, where, pretty close in their first meditation, they connect to what I'll call traumatic stimuli. That could be, again, dysregulating sensations, intrusive memories or thoughts, but they turn their attention inward and they find themselves quite overwhelmed. They try their best to stick with practice. But what ends up happening is, by kind of applying basic instructions, they end up feeling overwhelmed, dissociated, and a little bit worse for wear. They approach their teacher, and the teacher, who's not trained in trauma, basically says, if you stick with it, this will untangle for you. So I encourage you to just go back to the cushion. And the person does. And despite their best effort, it's not working. And so they end up feeling both dysregulated, but also somewhat ashamed, like that it's like they bought the best of intentions to practice. And even then they couldn't have a positive experience, and even meditation caused trouble. So these two paths that's been as a way to just let you know a little bit about me. This is what I've been studying really for the last, 15 years now. And I got very curious about it, and I'm going to use these two paths as kind of an anchor point for us here to have a conversation. And I, as Sean said, to research here, happy to talk about more of the empirical research out there if you like. But basically what I did is I used all the contemporary work, or the best contemporary work that I could find. Somatic experiencing, sensory motor work, work around exposure therapy. I took all the best knowledge to me that we have around trauma and trauma treatment, and I use that as a lens, kind of like a pair of glasses, to look at how people are practicing meditation in a contemporary way. I will acknowledge there's so many different traditions, of course, that are feeding into this, but what does it mean for someone who's coming to an app, for example, like a meditation app, or is going to a mindfulness-based stress reduction class? What would trauma theorists say about how we practice? What would they say about body scans? What would they say about long-term practice? So that's been my focus. And as Sean said, this book came out of it, and I do a lot of trainings now. And basically what I'm doing is training people who are offering mindfulness programs, interventions, practices. I'm training them in best practices around trauma. So my job is to really empower anyone, any one of you, around what would you need to know to recognize trauma, respond skillfully, and prevent re-traumatization in your work. And in doing that, I'm happy to talk about this more as well. It also feels important to be in a really dynamic conversation about trauma and what we mean by trauma, because trauma is a deep mirror, in my experience, for whose pain and whose groups, the communities whose pain is legitimized and seen and made visible, and whose pain is less visible. And in a moment of Black Lives Matter, and especially around the Me Too movement of recent years, I think there's just an increased importance having a really having conversations about trauma and how trauma impacts the nervous system. So that's what I'm up to. I'm grateful to be doing it, training folks. And I'll say just one more thing and then open it up here for a moment. The core, with getting back to those two people, the kind of the core inquiry I'm interested in is what happened to the second person? Like, why did they have trouble in meditation? I want to unpack that. And then how do we have it that as many people as possible have positive experiences inside of contemplative practice, or more like the first person? And in saying positive experiences, I don't just mean that people are coming to practice and it's great. Like, wow, it's so comfortable and easy. I am of the mind that the practices that many of us, I imagine, are training in is to actually empower people to be with more and more difficulty. And there are some people that might end up feeling overwhelmed inside of practice. So what would they need to not go down kind of a pitfall or a sinkhole in practice? And then how can we leverage practice towards trauma recovery and transformation? That's really what I'm down for and interested in.